we're gonna try and
Once we get zoned in, I'll be able to zone that out.
start with a cup.
Great.
Let's start with like cheers. All right, man. Cheers.
Cheers.
Let's pick up the conversation that we left off with. Gosh, I was trying to remember. I mean, this would have been easy research for me to do, but it's been at least 6-7 months since we had that recorded conversation. Do you recall?
Something like that. Yeah. It seems like it was cold outside, and it was last year.
We were wearing long sleeves at least. It could have just been cold in my office.
Could have been. I'm wanting to say it was like September or something.
Really?
Something like that, like close to the end of last October.
We'll find out. Maybe we can look it up.
Yeah.
But it's been a while since we've had a recorded conversation. That one was in my office, and now we're in your office. So
that's right.
First of all, thanks for the hospitality. We've got a really cool view of our city. Some of the highlights of the skyline here. We've got the Ohio River behind me, in front of you. I'm looking.
I could sit here for the whole hour and just tell you stories of things that we've seen from this view. Everything from like things happening downtown to one time we were having a team meeting and we looked out and somebody was swimming across the Ohio River. And so for the next 20 minutes, we just watched this whole episode unfold of somebody trying to swim across, and there was a barge coming around like very slowly, but it was like, oh my gosh, is this guy going to get run over by this barge? Wow. Is he going to go all the way across, or is he going to like swim out and come back? It was an adventure.
An adventure. That's good. Well, the word that I used, I was listening back to our conversation just a little bit ago, and the word that I used at the end was like some sort of celebration around being a sojourner with you for whatever's next. I'm buckling up and glad to have you as a fellow sojourner on this journey. This way.
Get yourself some boots, and we'll be on the journey together.
Okay, next time. As you're sort of seeking out like appropriate and helpful and empowering, those are the words that are coming to mind right now. Versions of church or community or gathering or communion. Right. We can jump off of any of those terms that you want.
Yeah.
And I also, I mean, we have talked, several times off camera since then, and the sort of church community that you've been spending some more time in is actually called Sojourn.
Right. Yeah.
which is, I just the irony of using that word, and I think at the time maybe that wasn't quite yet the case. So yeah. Tell us how your sojourn has gotten you maybe to sojourn as a little bit of a jumping off point and connective tissue from our last conversation.
Yeah. So I think in our last conversation, a lot of what we talked about was around sort of like the idea of deconstruction and kind of that personal journey of like, how do you grow as a person and process what you believe, and part of what you believe is also like, what communities are you a part of?
Yeah, the critical journey was something we discussed in not some depth, but we at least went through all the stages of it. Right. But yeah, and that opened it up to, if that's sort of the personal experience, then what does
that mean for community?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what has happened since our last conversation for me has been like continuing that search, I guess, for it's almost like looking for people who are on a similar journey that you can journey together with. I think is maybe a good way to describe it. And as we were preparing for this conversation, we were talking about a number of different topics that maybe a central theme or thread through all of those topics was this idea of like people finding their people, finding their tribe. Yeah. And I was reflecting on like, what exactly is a tribe and what does that mean and what's the function of that? And I really think it's the difference between finding your tribe or building a tribe and just having a group of friends or a community has to do with something related to purpose, or like a shared purpose or a shared journey. And so that idea of sojourn and the fact that our family is finding people who have a common experience, people who have a common direction, even in that context, is kind of ironic and fun. But I think that is what we've been looking for as a family. What I've been looking for is sort of like, how do we find people who we can process some big questions together with and do the journey of following Jesus together with in a way that has enough like alignment and compatibility that we mean the same things whenever we talk about some of those.
That's great. I'm really interested in. I imagine you didn't have an actual like checkbox of like these are the things that we're looking for, but during this sojourn, won't ask you to give like negative examples or where things were more dissonant, but like what were some of those points of resonance that you started to feel as you dipped your toes into this community? And I'm also actually even kind of imagining like Jordan Hall's description of how he had attempted to build some things on his own in terms of community, and then as he came into fellowship and ultimately communion with that church family, like the things that clicked and the things that didn't, and then ultimately I'm in.
So I went for the first time, and I had 3 different primary experiences. The first was a profound sense of the aliveness, the vitality, the health, and the wholesomeness of the people, and in particular the young people. Healthy, multi-generational families, healthy kids, healthy teenagers, and a sense of present joy and vitality, aliveness, and wholesomeness in the space. And by the way, from a purely theoretical perspective, that's the gold standard, right? That's the currency. That's the thing. Whatever produces that is the thing to be thinking about, to be orienting towards, but that's the measure, that's the test.
Maybe you can even go into if you're there yet.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting the difference between like finding a tribe or building a tribe, because I would say that kind of where I'm at right now is recognizing I have a lot of people in my life who I have real deep relationships with, who I would say we're on the same journey together. And what I mean by that is I feel that to some degree with like any other follower of Jesus who I meet, because there's this sense of like shared communion, shared relationship with Christ, and there's a certain level of like togetherness that I feel with anybody who is on that journey. But I think then there's like this more specific set of people who I would describe as like, I can tell that you're somebody who takes the gospel really seriously and like really, really lives in such a way that reflects that you believe that Jesus is really making all things new. And you embody like the personal sacrifice of Jesus in the way that you love your neighbors. You embody sort of the sense of hope in God's kingdom. You've sort of abandoned certain attachments to worldly systems and structures, and like attachments to pursuing like worldly power as a means of change.
Okay.
So I would say that's a much smaller group of people, but that I've had the privilege of like having people in my life who are that way. But I would say that's a little bit different than it's almost like there are all these one-on-one relationships, and often those people know each other. There's sort of like this loosely formed like Illuminati of Christians in our city who kind of like think this way and have this shared set of values.
No, you just said it, shared set.
or is it centered set? I remember Rob started me onto this idea of a centered set.
Yes, there's
Chapman. He is the former CEO of.
And we would and that idea of centered set versus bounded set is basically bounded set says we are defined as a group by how we're the same, a set of common traits or beliefs, whereas a centered set is we're bound together by a shared aim or goal that we're all moving towards this thing that's at the center, and as we move towards that, it brings us closer.
Would that almost an example of that almost be like the bounded set is you see the same people at church on a Sunday morning because you've decided to attend there and maybe be members there, versus going to a concert and then you see someone that you know there and you realize like, oh, we are attracted to the same thing, even though we didn't plan it. We are aligned based on what we're both sort of pointing at without any sort of explicit coordination.
It could be. I would say even in the example of a concert, to me that feels more like a bounded set.
Okay.
The whether you're in or you're out is we both like this kind of music. So that's a shared trait. I would think of a centered set as like, hey, we might be totally different people, but if we both want to see a particular kind of change in the community, then we could work together on that particular.
Okay.
So it's a shared aim. We're trying to accomplish something together. We're, it's almost more like a shared destination than a shared set of common traits. Like we're headed the same direction, which fits in nicely with that like sojourn analogy.
Yeah.
Like we're traveling together, we're headed the same direction, so let's travel together. But I think whenever I think about all of those different relationships, there's a difference between just knowing a bunch of people and having relationships with a bunch of people who are headed the same direction and being part of a tribe. Because I think being part of a tribe, there's sort of like a stated, we have some sort of structure or set expression of those shared values and a set of shared rituals maybe that we participate in together that give form and shape to that community, and that both function to affirm the shared identity that we have or the shared destination that we're moving towards, and also function to form us even further in that identity. So it'd be kind of like the difference between like, it'd be the difference between, to use your concert analogy, if I just know a bunch of people who like the same kind of music, that's cool and we can connect over that and sing each other songs or whatever. But if I had a group of people who it was like, we go to music festivals together, we go to concerts together, or even more so, we're in a band together. Being in a band together is like, we love this kind of music so much that we're producing something together. And we might be very different. We might have different personalities. We might have different skill sets musically, but we're coming together because we love this kind of music and we want to make this kind of music and enjoy this kind of music together. So there become these rituals of like, we're going to go to the same shows, we're going to wear the same t-shirts, and we're going to write songs together and that kind of thing. And so I think I'm in kind of a place where it's like, I have this very particular vision of how I'm trying to live out the way of Jesus in my community. And what I'm longing for is other people who are trying to live that out in the same way. And I know people like that, but I don't have the structure and community to like, it's like, hey, we like the same kind of music, let's start a band. It's like, and that's the thing that's missing is like the band practice and like, how do we get together? And I think what I'm recognizing is that experience is maybe not unique to me, or even unique to my particular worldview. Not everybody is maybe looking for a tribe for the same reasons that I am, but I'm recognizing that a lot of people are losing trust in their religious institutions and they're distancing themselves from those communities. A lot of people are losing trust in their sort of like political institutions that they're a part of, and they're distancing themselves from those spaces. And so I'm really kind of fascinated by this idea that maybe a lot of people are looking for meaning and purpose and a place to belong, and that both of those things are sort of fulfilled in this sense of like, how do I connect with other people who are headed the same direction? And maybe it's easier to do that when you have a lot of clarity about what your direction is.
Yeah.
But I'd be curious to hear your perspective on this, because when I think about like the estuary piece, it feels like that's a little bit of an effort to create some sense of a tribe around some kind of shared journey, or looking for something. And so I'm curious to hear, like, what's your experience? Does that idea of looking for a tribe kind of resonate with you, and what have you learned from
totally
those experiments?
I've got a whole bunch of different things going off in my head as you were describing all of that, and a little bit of John Vervaeke's 4 P's of knowing. I don't know if we've ever talked about this before. There's the propositional, like, do you agree with the propositions? And then there's the perspectival and the procedural. And then the one that maybe resonates the most for me is the participatory.
Right.
And estuary seems to be, at least the way that my perspectival knowing of participating in this is that there really is very little of the propositional. You know, my P's right here. Instead of
people can bring all different sorts of propositions into that space,
yes,
and still belong and interact, even if they have very different propositional perspectives.
Yes.
Is that right?
And that is that it's like you can belong and behave and interact because like that's the thing that unifies us, is more of how we behave, not what we believe, or maybe a little bit of why we don't believe it. It's hard to get the language right with this, because I'm also thinking back now to Jordan Hall's conversation with his atheist friend Jim Rutt, and part of Jim's response was going to Jordan's church's website and going to the What We Believe section.
I went to the website of your church, which we're not going to mention because we want to let those people have some privacy. And I read the statement of basic beliefs. Anyone pursuing membership and or baptism must agree with the statement. Here's one of them. I'm going to read a few of them. I want to get your reaction to each one. There is one and only living and true God. He is an intelligent, spiritual, and personal, I'll underscore the word personal, being. Do you actually believe that?
I do.
Okay.
This was similar to kind of what you were describing before, of like these are the things that maybe unite us, but it's on that propositional level. Well,
and that would be a bounded set.
Yes,
it's
that's
like
the bounded set.
It's you're in if you check all these boxes, and if you don't, then this might not be the place for you.
Yeah. And the part about estuary is it's like we're going to agree to how we behave and how we respect each other by engaging in curiosity and confidentiality. But because it's mostly around those kinds of values of behavior, it allows very dissonant beliefs to sort of exist.
Sure.
And if people are sort of bringing what's most alive for them and putting it on the table there metaphorically, like in an honest way, that connects us in a way that's either beyond or above, depending on how you're looking at those 4 Ps of a propositional commitment.
Sure.
So that's to answer that question, and then maybe to flip it back to you. And another conversation that we've had, not recorded, is around this emergent church movement. So there's a podcast that we both started to listen to and explore, and I think we even set up a coffee date to discuss it, and then before,
and that became this.
Yeah, I was like,
podcast,
let's just record it because maybe it'd be really good and juicy.
Every 500 years, the Latinized culture goes through a huge upheaval, and we're going through one right now.
every time that happens, whatever form of Christianity has to drop back and reconfigure. It doesn't ever cease to be.
Because from what I'm getting from this podcast, which is basically a retrospective of different events happening in the last 20 or 30 years around what was called the emerging church movement. And it almost broke up into two separate versions of what they were focused on. There was sort of the theological changes that people were saying, at a propositional level, I'm not sure if I believe this like I used to.
Right.
In a response to postmodernism and maybe even being postmodern for many of these folks, versus or in addition to changes in how they gathered and experienced God together in a worship context.
Yeah.
So both of those things are coming alive for me, and that's what I started to take from it. And I'll hit the ball back to you and let it go where it needs to go for you on that.
Yeah. So I'm a few episodes in to the Emerged podcast, and I'd heard of the emergent church movement, and my impression of it was mostly around that more like how we do church together side of things, that it was like we're gonna not be bound by traditional expressions of church, and we're gonna try doing things differently. And to hear this other side of it too, and how those two pieces fit together, has been really interesting. Of we're gonna create space for asking theological questions and having more dialogue and discussion, and also we're gonna push the boundaries of how we can experiment with gathering. And it's interesting that both in the example of Estuary that you're talking about and in the example of the emergent church movement, they're sort of tribes that are formed around a similar set of questions, that it's not so much we're going to gather around a similar set of answers as it is we're all asking the same questions, so let's get together and ask them together. And there's something kind of exciting and interesting about that. And I think maybe the strength of those movements is partially in when you begin to ask questions and experiment with things, it can feel really lonely because you feel like you're stepping away from things that feel really stable. And there's a little bit of risk involved in that stepping away process on both of those fronts. There's a lot of comfort in knowing these are the answers that we have.
Certainty.
And there's a lot of comfort in knowing this is the way that we do things. But when you begin to recognize, I don't know that our answers and our way of doing things are quite sufficient for the kinds of challenges that we're facing in our real lives, then there becomes this need to experiment and explore and to grow. And so it's just interesting to me, this idea of people finding each other in that journey. And it almost makes me wonder, when you start to ask questions, asking questions is, it's a pursuit of some kind of answer, not just on the propositional side, but on the how should we do things side. That experimentation and exploring, I think for most people, they want to arrive at some kind of conclusion, maybe not forever. Maybe they want to have a continual asking, but you don't want to always ask questions your whole life and never arrive at any kind of answers, because that is just exhausting and
lonely.
And so it's interesting to me to reflect on movements like that and to say, first of all, I wonder, is being a part of a tribe like that where you're asking questions, is that sort of inevitably going to end either in we're going to arrive at similar answers and this newly formed tribe is going to kind of solidify and take on more structure? Or is it this group of people that I'm asking these questions together with and journeying with, we're probably going to go our separate ways at some point, because we're all going to find, answers that we're looking for, things like that. And I'd imagine that probably depends on what kinds of questions you're asking and where people are headed. But
yeah, I mean, and that's kind of what seemed to happen with this emergent church movement. I don't know if you've gotten, I'm not sure which number of the episode it is, but it started out kind of under this banner of emerge or emerging, or at some point early on that title felt helpful.
Yeah.
But then they really started to realize that some folks were in it for that sort of, we're changing these methodological approaches, but we're not messing with theology. And then it's like recognizing, oh, we are on a different path, and we're going to change our fellowship or affiliation with each other to let you have that path, and we're going to go on another one. And I remember, I mean, I don't know a lot of these people, but a lot of the folks that were interviewed talk about how comforting and reassuring and encouraging it was to find those fellow travelers, and then somehow agree, oh, okay, so what we're doing is this emergent thing. Oh, we are doing the same thing. But then my understanding, I haven't finished the podcast, that some of it had kind of fizzled out, and it's the movement may be over, by many people's eyes. So whatever movement may be happening now is not necessarily any continuation of that. But
well, and I think it's interesting to reflect on. Like, I think people would look at, I think when you're part of a movement or something that feels like a movement, if it fizzles out, it can feel like that was a failure, and it can feel like disappointing, because I think the whole idea of a movement is we're all headed in the same direction because we're dissatisfied with where we're at right now. And we believe in some kind of change that needs to happen in the world, and we're going to help bring about that change together. And I think whenever you look back and reflect on something like that and you see that it fizzled out, it can feel like, man, we really believed in something and then it didn't happen, and that was disappointing. But I wonder if like maybe the nature of movements is not that they last forever, but that they get us from one place to another.
They moved us, right?
They
moved us from one place to another.
And maybe it's sort of like the success of a movement is not that it lasts forever and that we stay together forever, but that we're on this journey together and we all move from one place to another. And maybe sometimes it's not even so much about how we're going to move the world from one place to another, but how are we as individuals going to move from one place to another? And I would be really interested, and maybe they get into this later in the podcast, I'd be really interested to know, like, the role that movement and being a part of it has played in specific people who were part of it, and how is that influencing the role that they play in their life and community today, And I think about, like, if I'm trying to find a tribe or be part of some kind of movement here locally, it's sort of like, what's the change that I hope to see in my own life, and where am I trying to get to, and where do I hope other people can get to as well?
Something just like totally came alive as you were saying that for me around, all right, go with me here, the tribe of Israel. Okay, and recognizing some of my own hang-ups. Like when I was really going through deconstruction, which ended up in a deconversion, a lot of it was around my, and you had mentioned some aspects of this. I won't put it all on you, but when you went to UE and you started meeting people who were out, you were experiencing cultures and traditions and perspectives that were far outside of what you had experienced up until that point.
Yeah.
And so, taking that to something more international, like actual different tribes.
Sure.
This was a big part of what broke down for me on a propositional level of the story of the tribe of Israel, even going to the story of Jesus specifically being this thing that you have to know about at some sort of cognitive propositional level in order to then make a decision for Jesus or to reject Jesus. And that is the game, if you will. It's a crass term, but that is the game that humanity is playing. God created this game, and there's one specific tribe that you have to know about and understand. And if you were never exposed to that, if your tribe was never exposed to that, you're out of the game. And feeling like I needed to embrace some sort of theology or worldview that allowed for multiple tribes or multiple games or some way that someone could experience God that transcended those sorts of propositions about, do you believe that Jesus actually existed? Do you believe he actually rose from the dead? Do you accept him and let your life be transformed by him? That if I took those off the table too, it starts to get to a really unbounded place. It's like I had to ask those questions, but I didn't like asking those questions because it was like I was in Plato's allegory of the cave, and I kept going up and thinking that I'm at the surface. Oh, look, and there's the sun. And then I just decide, maybe that sun isn't really there. And I'm in outer space and nothingness and dark matter. And it's like, please let me get back. I'll take the sun. Give me the sun. Give me something that I can live by. Sorry, I went a little wild there. And any thoughts on that aspect of the?
Yeah, well, let me ask like kind of a, I guess, clarifying question. It sounds like you're sort of saying like you felt like the Christian perspective that you were familiar with was too narrow or limited. So it was like, okay, let me expand this. Let me expand this. Let me expand this. And then you got to a place where it was sort of like, okay, this is too expansive. I'm too like, it's all questions and no answers. And I need something to be rooted in. And I need to start to like find something that I can cling to and like anchor my sense of how I see the world needs to be rooted in something. I have to have some kind of it's point of reference, maybe.
It's something around that. It's like if you are, let's go take it to the emerging church movement, when it started to become that the theological tribe or whatever was asking questions that were beyond the pale. Like we are not questioning the inerrancy of Scripture. Like that, we're talking about whether we use smoke machines or not.
Right.
We are not questioning the inerrancy of Scripture.
Sure.
And that there's that separation. So there were people here that were questioning the inerrancy of Scripture, and then landed in a place of appreciation for it, and then maybe others the actual historicity of Jesus or something, and then they're like, you actually can't question that. So like, there were certain questions that were too far, and there's part of me that wants to always like never be afraid to ask a question. Like if you are afraid to ask it, maybe that's a sign that that's where you need to look for it or whatever.
Sure.
But you can't just live asking questions everywhere, or else you end up you don't end up anywhere. Yeah. There's not movement, or I guess there's spinning.
Yeah.
You're not moving towards something, you're spinning.
Yeah.
And you get dizzy.
Yeah.
And you get sick. And take the metaphor wherever you want to go there.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good. And I think in our last conversation, our last podcast conversation, we talked a little bit about how we both recognized this sense of hesitation around deconstruction within the church because it was something that people were fearful of. It's sort of like this slippery slope sort of thing.
Don't ask
like,
about,
man, there are certain questions that it's healthy to ask, but there's a certain point at which like you're just going to become like untethered from the ship and you're lost at sea. You're floating, and you have nowhere to anchor you, and
that's a little bit of what we use to describe estuary sometimes, is to say if you're coming at it from some sort of like church thought, this is a place where you can ask questions and bring up topics that you might feel uncomfortable asking or bringing up at church.
Yeah.
That is part of it.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, I recognize that dynamic, and I think it's an important one to pay attention to. I'm trying to reflect on, like, in my own life and experience, what that's been like for me. I think in our last conversation, we talked a little bit about how I felt like I was in this place through that whole process of, like, every time I would ask big questions, it was sort of like I felt a sense of still being anchored to Jesus, the person.
Mm-hmm.
And it was sort of like I didn't feel that same fear of asking questions that I sensed in some other Christians. And it was because I felt some sense of, like, faith and confidence in Jesus, the person, and my lack of confidence was in maybe what I had been taught or in other Christians or in church structures and communities. But it was sort of like every time I would allow myself to ask questions of Jesus, the person, and reflect on, like, do I think I can really trust Jesus? And do I think that Jesus is real and really is who he says he is? I just, at the end of that line of questioning was always, it always reassured me. It was always a sense of, like, yeah, I think I can. And again, it wasn't even that I was afraid to ask those questions. It was, okay, how can I know that? How can I test that? And the two things that I looked at were, like, I had a professor who was really helpful in, like, digging into ancient Christianity and, like, the historicity of Jesus and how confident can we be that the people who knew him personally face to face really believed what we think they believed and things like that. And then I think the other aspect was just reflecting on my own personal experience and asking myself the questions, like, the sense of, like, walking with Jesus that I've had in my life, is it possible that that's all a delusion and that that's all just been me?
Yeah.
And at the end of that line of questioning, I'm always like, I don't think so. I don't. And so I guess for me, it has always felt like I can ask all these other questions, but and even ask questions about, like, the person of Jesus and the nature of my relationship with Jesus. But for me, that has always terminated in me feeling more confident in the person of Jesus and oftentimes simultaneously more discontent with a lot of the religious systems and structures that I've been a part of. And that's been an interesting tension because like the way that I would think about how to follow Jesus, it's not a solo activity either. So it's like, and I think that's why this sense of, like, I feel like I need community and I need expressions of community to really, like, follow Jesus well. And I almost feel like I have to find them or create them, because a lot of existing systems and structures, I feel like, just kind of fall short of really getting me to where I'm trying to get, if that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. I've got a question on this then. Are you familiar with the word sonder?
Mm-hmm.
What definition, like, what comes to mind when you think of the word sonder? Because it's
this is a made up word. All words are made up, but this is a word that was intentionally created. I forget the guy who he did this project where he created a series of words for experiences that there weren't words for.
Wow, you know the etymology of this more than I do.
And and so all of his other ones are really good too. But my understanding is that sonder is the experience of seeing another person and recognizing that they have a story that is just as complex as your own, and that in the same way that they play this very minute role in your story, like somebody who's sitting next to you on an airplane or something, and you don't know anything about them. Sure. You have this experience of recognizing I'm equally insignificant in their story. It's a unique sense of like empathy from a distance, or being able to recognize like every person you meet has a story and a perspective that's just as complex as your own. And you're you're a tiny blip in their narrative,
And that's sort of like, so that, first of all, I'm glad that you have such a rich understanding of it. And going back to like the allegory of the cave, right? It's told from the perspective of a person who's being released or liberated, or having an individual experience. But then there are other people in the story. And when you talked about needing to maybe shed beliefs or paradigms or whatever that were handed to you from different organizations or religions or traditions,
or at least reevaluate and
reevaluate it because some things not resonating the way that it should, and then knowing that others do resonate that way, or do resonate with that. Gosh, now my mind is going to all these sort of different political things in our moment right now. So we're recording this at the very beginning of 2025. Donald Trump's just begun his second term as president. I have no idea when someone is watching this what has happened since then, but that's sort of the context.
It has been a doozy of a 2 weeks.
It's been a couple of weeks, and a lot has kind of happened. But even in the build up to that, this whole last 8-9 years or so, the political tribalization has this sort of new twist to where faith, and specifically Christianity, is something that's kind of back on the table, and that it's not, debates aren't, keep your faith at home, separation of church and state kind of debates that I've perceived. It's more, we're going to interpret the prayer given at the inauguration that chastises Trump or encourages him to show mercy and kindness, versus how other people, we'll call it Christian nationalism. That's a term that hopefully people are familiar with.
Yeah.
It's all under the banner of Christian. Like, it's like sort of assumed, okay, we're all going to debate or discuss or engage in what we should do, with an understanding of maybe there is a should that came from Jesus.
Yeah,
I think that's interesting.
Yeah, well, and it goes back to that idea of like a tribe having those points of divergence, right? That there are a lot of people who identify as Christian, and I think we're in a place right now of recognizing that not everybody means the same thing when they use those words.
Totally.
And I think
even, sorry to interrupt. You had mentioned 84% of our community identifies as Christian. So
yeah. So I think it puts people in this unsettling and defensive place on both sides, or all sides, because it's not just two interpretations of what that word would mean. But I think it creates this environment where, there's a sense of like, I really need to protect what this term means to me. And part of that is identifying and calling out like, well, they say that that's what it means to be Christian, but they're not really one of us, and you see that happen in a lot of different ways. Some of those ways I think are important and healthy. Some of them are toxic and unhealthy and unhelpful. But again, that relates to that personal experience you were describing too, of like needing a sense of rootedness and anchor. And I think in a lot of different examples of tribes, I mean, you see this with the Republican Party right now. So it's not just within religious context, but in all kinds of contexts where we share a common label. You go through these seasons of divergence, and in those moments, we have to decide, how are we going to, what's the standard by which we determine if something meets this criteria or not? And you can bring that back to bounded set and centered set. You can bring it back to centered, bounded set or centered set.
Even the Republican Party has a name for this: Republican in name only.
Yeah,
where they've said, here's somebody who uses this label, but we can see by their behaviors that they are not aligned with us.
And what happens is different people have a different set of standards for what qualifies as Christian or not Christian, Republican or not Republican, Democrat or not Democrat, true Cubs fan or not,
Okay, this is great that you brought up baseball, because I had this vivid memory just flashback. It was at a baseball stadium. It might have even been a Cubs game. It was in Arizona. It might have been with the Cubs, but I was sat next to a guy. This is great. We talked about the concert thing. Are we in a bounded set or a centered set? We're going to watch a baseball game together. Yeah. Somehow the conversation gets to, what do we do for a living? And I think, stopped being a pastor. And he still was a pastor. And he kind of asked me, what's going on with that? And I said, yeah, well, I kind of have had some, struggles with this whole LGBT thing. This was before the Q was even added to that. Okay, so this is late 2000s, something like that, 2006 maybe. And he didn't understand what I meant by that. And he said, yeah, well, it's a sin is a sin. Am I right? And his sort of face lit up, and I realized in that moment,
he thought that he had found somebody who had the same perspective, but actually you didn't.
Yes, yeah. and
interesting.
And I didn't know how. I'm going to be sitting next to him for the rest of the game, and he got really excited. And it was this recognition for me that this is not my home, or wherever his home is, wherever his tribe is. I am being pulled out of there. Yeah. That is. It wasn't a, hey, I found somebody who's part of my tribe. It was, oh gosh, we are going in different directions. Yeah. And it's stuck with me, but in the background, and then it just sort of popped up, and then you mentioned the Cubs, and I'm like,
I think
wow.
I think it comes down to, like, what's the standard by which we define the tribe, right? And again, I think for me, like, the definition that I would have for are you a Christian or are you not a Christian is not primarily around a set of beliefs or practices. It's, are you in Christ or not? Like, and this was like a radical shift for me in my understanding of Christianity and of Jesus and of the gospel, was when I got into, like, really studying the New Testament and this idea of union with Christ, that that Christianity is about us being made one with Jesus and reconciled to God in that way, and that all these other things that we talk about, like forgiveness and the kind of sense of spiritual growth and healing and reconciliation, like, those things aren't gifts that are external to Jesus, that Jesus, like, delivers to us and is like, here's some forgiveness, here's some grace. That all of those things are in Christ, and that the benefits of the benefits of, like, the promises of God, the idea of being in God's kingdom, all come by way of, like, being joined together with Christ in this sort of mystical way. And so that's, like, the highest standard for me, and everything else is, like, secondary. We figure out, how do we behave, how do we believe out of that, not into that. And so, I look at, like, when Paul's writing about sexual ethics to the church in Corinth, he says to flee from sexual immorality, and the basis of that is, don't you recognize that your bodies are members of Christ? Don't you recognize that your body is now part of Christ, that you're somehow mystically, like, joined together with him? And are you going to take your body now and go do things that are unholy and unrighteous with that? And so it becomes the basis for what we believe and how we relate to one another and how we relate to the world around us. And what we believe. And so I think that sense of like rootedness and anchorness, that again, that personal experience you describe of like kind of floating out here and trying to figure out how do I get rooted and anchored in something. For me, it's like for Christians, I think that's got to be defined by the person of Jesus and how we relate to him, not in an abstract way, but in like a real way. Like we believe that he's actually a real person and that we're connected to him in some way. But that's like messy and complicated.
Well, and what's coming to mind for me right now is actually like my most recent conversation on this YouTube channel was with Gary Mazo, Rabbi Gary Mazo,
right?
Jewish person, and I don't know if we talked very much about his relationship with Jesus. Gary, maybe it's time to have that conversation soon. But like that, I feel a little bit of tension or friction or static around like, if Gary loves me or I see Gary love others, living that life of love, going back to that whole critical journey thing, like the ultimate expression of that is living a life of love.
Yeah, right.
And yet doesn't recognize what he's doing is participating in Jesus the person, is that means for some sort of disfellowship or recognition of a tribal boundary, or like, do you see sort of what I'm describing there? And that's just one person who happens to be in my life, in my community, but it is somebody that I love and who loves me, and I've seen love others. We've loved others together. And so if I frame it in that sort of critical journey stage of living a life of love, there's fellowship. If I frame it in terms of participation in Christ, the way that I'm understanding Christ as a person of Jesus, it feels like I can't. There's some sort of false note that isn't accordant with that harmony. To mix metaphors even further.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good. And I what comes to mind for me as you're saying that is, I think something that I've found is a reflection of my own life that maybe sets me apart from a lot of my Christian peers. Not all of them, obviously. I think I've learned how to be really clear about what it means to be part of the church as a tribe, and also exist in a world with people who don't share that same perspective or are not part of Christ, and to be a part of a tribe with them as well. And I think that's a really important aspect of Christian living that a lot of Christians are struggling to grasp and to embody right now, is this idea that like I have dual citizenship as like part of God's kingdom, and I'm really clear about what that means and what it takes to be part of God's kingdom. But I'm also still like a resident of Evansville, Indiana, and I have neighbors, like Rabbi Gary, who they want a lot of the same things for this community that I want, and I can be a good neighbor to them and be part of the Evansville tribe with them, and also be part of this, and one isn't jeopardized by the other.
That's good. I think that's good and interesting. I need to meditate on that a little more, because I think when I think of even the word kingdom, like I like what comes to mind is like the Crusades and like an actual sword and like and like it's. I need to maybe unpack what kingdom can mean because you can't be a citizen of England and France at the same time.
Yeah.
And so I think I may have some baggage around the kingdom of heaven that I'm just now recognizing right now as we're talking.
Well, and I think I would say that the message of the gospel of Jesus and the kingdom is Jesus did come to, in some sense, conquer the world, right? He said to his followers, all authority in heaven and on earth have been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples and teach them to follow me and obey me. And he said, fear not, for I've overcome the world. Like he uses that kind of language, but it's very clear that Jesus's way of conquering the world is very different than worldly ways of conquering the world. He said to Pilate right before he was executed, if my kingdom were of this earth, my servants would come and fight. But my kingdom's not from this earth. And so like his way of conquest is not a worldly way of conquest. It's conquest by way of compassion and self-sacrificial love. It's sort of like, I'm going to get you to join my kingdom by dying for you and loving you so well that you like can't help but to want to be part of it. And I think that's maybe a little more what Christians need to learn how to embrace as a means of looking to expand the kingdom of God, is like, it's not by beating people over the head with it and like convincing, it's not by coercion, it's by love, self-sacrificial love, and invitation.
Defense even. You had mentioned last time about Peter wanting to defend Jesus as he gets arrested.
He doesn't need you to defend him. And so, I think there's something there that's, I'm meditating on that with you as well, trying to figure out what that looks like.
All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. We're sort of meditating on what the kingdom of God looks like, and I am struck by the fact, even though we're not members of the same church, let's say, and I still like, it feels still weird to identify as a Christian. Like there's still that sort of part of me that's like, if I say that to somebody, they're going to think things that I think if we went to those things, and I was like, well, do you believe this? Do you believe this? Do you believe this? And if I don't, they'll say, actually, you're not a Christian.
Yeah.
So I nip it in the bud, and I end it before it can begin by not even giving myself that label necessarily.
Yeah. You're trying to figure out, how far am I in the cave versus not in the cave,
or off in outer space, somewhere else, or thinking that I'm off in outer space. And so I carry that tension of the label, but I just want to reiterate, I do recognize in you someone, like, what you're looking for and what you are living is good to me and attractive to me. It's not, I don't have that same sense that I had with the guy at the baseball field when I see you living your Christian life. So whether that needed to be said or not, I'm saying it.
Well, thank you.
I'm excited to hear what happens next when we do another conversation like this, and I'm glad that you were open to recording it and getting it out there for other people, and maybe there'll be comments and conversations that can spur whatever happens for our next conversation.
Yeah. Well, I always enjoy talking with you, and I hope that others can find some kind of value in that conversation as well.
Cool. Do you want to plug the new boots?
Yeah. I had my old pair of Thursday boots last time. Now I have a new pair. So Thursday boots, if you're watching.
Yeah, we need an affiliate link or something.
Yeah, we're still open to sponsorships. So.
And I said I was going to wear mine, but yeah, I decided to go with these gray Tommy Hilfigers instead.
Nice. But you did buy some, so.
That's right. I do have the new wineskins. I just need to pour myself into them, and we'll see if I wear them next time.
Right.
So.
Well, thanks again.
Man. Yep. Cheers.